Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is April the 3rd, 2025. Thursday, April 3rd, 2025. And we're off to Stranger Than Fiction stories for the first glimpse into the weird, shall we say. And this is titled High Strangeness at Lone Pine. Lone Pine, California has only one road with a traffic light. Whitney Portal Road heads westward across Highway 395, traversing the Alabama hills and onto Mount Whitney, which is 9 miles away. It is the tallest mountain in mainland United States. Like many routes that started out as trails, they are witness to human traffic and tragedy, and inevitably tales of hauntings. The Paiute Indians lived there, and before the Civil War, settlers moved into the area. Many of them raised cattle and sheep. It was not long before conflicts developed as the Indians' food source was driven away. They resorted to eating the settlers' cattle, and in 1861, the Owens Valley Indian War ensued between the native tribe and U.S. soldiers. Like many places where witness warfare, a phantom reenactment of the battle takes place, and throughout the years, many residents have heard the sound of gunfire close to their homes. The following describes an incident reported by a woman in the 1960s. Quote, she lived on Whitney Portal Road, and she offered heard gunfire one evening. Looking out the window, she saw a black man dressed as an Indian warrior. He glanced back at her, but didn't bother her or confront her. He was soon joined by several additional Indians. They all crouched behind a tree and began firing rifles, reloading as necessary. The firing went on for 15 minutes, with not a bullet hitting the woman's house. Then, just like that, they all disappeared. Apparently, the tale is fairly common amongst those who have lived in the neighborhood. Those who have heard the woman's tale believe the black man to have probably been an ex-slave, now living among the Native Americans. Old bullet holes were even discovered in the direction the ghost had been firing in. End quote. By 1867, rich mines were discovered and developed in the vicinity of Lone Pine. Like all boom towns, hotels, stores, saloons, and fandango houses were erected. Not all tragedies were due to battles. In that same year of 1867, a Mexican known as Indian Jesus, probably pronounced Indian Jesus, shot a man named William Johnson in the head, but he in turn was shot in the groin, though not fatally. It all started over a card game, and both men had a notorious reputation well known in Los Angeles. At the same time, in another household, a man jealous of the attention his wife was receiving from a male friend of the family attempted to shoot her. Her mother sprang in front of her and was shot in the side. She survived, and the husband was arrested. During those years, conflicts still existed between the natives and the settlers. In 1868, an Indian chief known as Manassas was ambushed and murdered. The chief was well known in those parts since he led a band of renegades and cutthroats. 3 years before, they shot and killed a miner named Dutchy, and a year before he rolled stones down an inclined shaft at Cerro Gordo and crushed a Mexican working there. He went to the man's body, took out his brains, and shot the corpse with several arrows. Manassas's murder was believed to be retaliation. Another entrepreneur who settled in Long Pine during those tumultuous years was Lola Travis, who arrived with her brother and 3 children. In 1868, she bought a property on the corner of Main and Water Street and built a saloon there. She then sold half of the property to Charles Mason, who established his general store. They had become acquainted when they were both at the gold camps in Colombia, and they maintained a good business relationship until the early 1880s when she sold the saloon. It then became known as Richard's Saloon. The American Hotel was built in 1871 and stood for 149 years before burning in 2020, a year to the date it was opened. During the 1870s, Lone Pine provided supplies to the nearby mining camps such as Cerro Gordo, Keeler, Swansea, Darwin, and Tramway. They were eventually deserted and became ghost towns. In 2019, the show Ghost Adventures filmed at Cerro Gordo. There's another urban myth pertaining to who is known as Rescue Man or Indian Jim. He was a gold prospector who was trapped in a sudden blizzard in the Alabama hills and froze to death. The legend tells of how he now warns others to leave the hills and return to the town while they can. The first person to have encountered Jim was another Indian named George, who was up in the hills looking for tungsten. He heard someone calling his name. Then Jim appeared and said, "Go," pointing towards Lone Pine. George took the warning to heart and returned to town. just ahead of a strong blizzard that would have killed him had he stayed where he was. No verification can be found for the story of Indian Jim, but perhaps the urban myth is an extension of what happened to another miner. Strangers from across the world come to Lone Pine and Cerro Gordo to work and find their fortunes. Some of them died in anonymity, with nothing beyond a first name to tell their story, such as the story of Andre that appeared in the Inyo Independent on February 14th, 1880. Last Monday, John Cartheny, while on the trail from Swansea to Beveridge District, found the body of a man frozen, stuffed in the snow near the summit of the Inyos, at a point about 15 miles from Swansea. The fact was made known to Coroner John A. Lang, who went to the spot and had the frozen body packed on a mule and sent on the road to Swansea, where it was hauled to Lone Pine, where on the 8th an inquest was held in due form. From testimony there elicited, it was found the deceased was named Andre, a native of France, aged about 53 years, and that he perished from exposure to cold on Saturday or Sunday last. He was found lying face down on about 3 feet of snow. His blankets were lying within arm's length. Coroner Lank further informs us that his feet were drawn up towards his face, and that the body was frozen so perfectly solid that it was impossible to move a limb in the slightest degree, and that in that form the body was hung across the pack animal and packed out of the mountains. Deceased came from Lake District not long ago and was a stranger to these parts. He was buried in the Lone Pine Cemetery. End quote. Death and life went hand in hand, and so did opportunity. So Lola Travis, sensing brighter horizons than those available in Lone Pine, moved on to Cerro Gordo and established a brothel named the Palace of Pleasure. The town is situated high on Buena Vista Peak at an elevation of 8,500 feet, with Owens Valley far below. It was primarily known for silver and lead mining operations that spanned from 1866 to 1957. At one point, it was California's largest producer of silver. Lola competed with another madam named Maggie Moore, who owned the waterfall, in a place where mines produced $2 million in bullion. In 1874 alone, there was plenty of money to be made by entertaining lonely miners. However, loneliness, liquor, and mean tempers make bad bedfellows. In 1873, in Maggie Moore's whorehouse alone, 7 men were shot and 4 killed outright. At one point, there was an average of 1 murder per week in Cerro Gordo. Scared for her life, the town doctor left due to the unrestrained violence, and the law was miles away. The deaths continued and its populace stumbled along until 1938 when the Union Mine closed down. The May 7th, 1875 edition of the Los Angeles Times reported on a strange robbery at Cerro Gordo. Quote, at a place known as the Yellow Grade, 3 miles from Cerro Gordo, 4 men simultaneously appeared armed with shotguns and, covering the driver, halted the stage, while the other 6 unhooked the horse from the stage and tied up the passengers. The driver was requested to step off to one side and sit down upon a rock, meantime being covered with a shotgun in the hands of one of the robbers. The robbers then went through the passengers for all they had, and taking the United States Mail and Wells Fargo and Company's box, they packed them on one of the horses and started off. End quote. However, it wasn't only murderous miners that brought high strangeness to Lone Pine. Only 5 miles south of the town is Owens Lake, which measured 90 miles in length and 14 miles wide, with a depth of 30 feet. The Owens River and other springs supplied it with water. Alkali, borax, and strong elements charged it so thoroughly that it cut leather and cloth as well as destroyed grease and soap. Mount Whitney sits off its west side with rugged mountains rising from the east. Southward lies a dry valley. Despite its inhospitable composition, in the 1860s there were reports of a serpent-like creature that made it home there. In 1868, the San Francisco Examiner reported the following, quote, the Owens Lake monster has been seen once more. Sometime before the sun went down, 2 young men were riding along on horseback on the west side of Owens Lake. They lived in the valley and had heard the stories of the Mexicans who saw something strange on the lake one night, but was not generally believed. Both of these men had frequently scanned the surface of the lake to verify the story, but neither of them had seen anything of the serpent until the night in question. On this occasion, they observed something unusual about a mile from shore. A huge animal was swimming rapidly along, throwing out waves on both sides. and went half a mile, then went back below the surface a few moments. Then it came up. It started on the backtrack for a mile or so. They described the creature to be 100 feet long and over 4 feet in diameter and of a grayish color. Colonel Stevens, superintendent of a mining company at Lone Pine, saw the monster in June 1868, and his description coincided with the report of these men in regards to its length and color. The colonel said he saw it throw water 50 feet high. In 1913, the lake went dry after the Owens River was diverted into the Los Angeles Aqueduct. During the 1870s, Owens Lake was used to transport bullion and supplies for the mines at Cerro Gordo with its steamships Bessie Brady and the Molly Stevens. Present-day winds stir up alkali dust storms, and shallow flooding has been used to stifle the dust. This has brought shorebirds back to the lake. In 2023, the lake flooded for the first time in over 100 years due to numerous storms that struck California during the first 3 months of that year. The mystery persists, though, as to how a sea serpent ended up in the lake and how it could survive in the water. Could it have been the product found at the bottom of a bottle? On March 26, 1872, a 7.6 magnitude earthquake hit Lone Pine, which did not leave a building standing. Those that survived described hearing screams and groans coming from many of the populace, which were buried beneath the ruins of the mud and adobe structures. The first shock was followed by three more. Strong trembling was felt for over 3 hours. A chasm opened up extending for 35 miles down the Owen Valley, ranging from 3 inches to 40 feet in width. 26 people lost their lives. A mass grave just north of the town commemorates the site of the main fault. Lone Pine and the nearby Alabama Hills have been the location for hundreds of films, commercials, and television shows. In 1920, the films Cupid the Cowpuncher, starring Will Rogers, and The Last Roundup were produced there. Godzilla, Iron Man, and Transformers Revenge of the Fallen are only some of the ones filmed there in the 21st century. So there you go. And I believe recently someone rebuilt one of the hotels and is going to, I think, try to salvage it. But is basically, for all intents and purposes, it's a ghost town. And a lot of interesting history. A lot of interesting history as to what people get up to when you mix. And that's what happens. A lot of people go out there thinking, I'm going to make money. They come from all over the world, especially, remember California gold rush in 1849? A lot of people come to these towns, and not everybody's reputable. How's that? There's some that go out there not to mine, but to sell stuff. They're going to make their money. And, but you hear a lot of murders, people getting murdered for their claims, for what they've staked. And they're very secretive because they don't want anybody to know maybe if they've found something. And of course, all those mine companies, they needed employees. And sometimes the mix you get, you don't have to worry about anything happening to you on the job. You have to worry about your fellow miners. But very interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of other strange stories going on there. Next story is still out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories. And this one is titled An Unusual Serial Killer. There is a little known but very interesting case of a serial sexual killer who targeted older women. Between 1995 to 1997, he claimed 15 lives in the city of Apula, also known as Puglia, located in Italy's Heel. The murder of 15 women, all over the age of 70, was not initially attributed to a serial killer. Different persons were accused, tried and convicted of murders they had not committed, before authorities realized all the bloodshed was the handiwork of one individual. Based upon where a particular victim lived, murder investigations were conducted by 3 different jurisdictions. Therefore, autopsies were performed by different pathologists. Eventually, connection was made that the same perpetrator was responsible for the crimes, but only within the jurisdiction where a group of murders occurred. The majority of the victims were stabbed multiple times in the neck, except for 3 cases in which the cause of death was manual strangulation. There was evidence of sexual assault in only one of the cases. The highest number of stab wounds listed in a single case was 25. Wounds were consistent with being inflicted from the front by a right-handed individual. A knife was never recovered at any of the crime scenes since the offender took the weapon with him. Eventually, a forensic pathologist and a forensic psychiatrist reviewed the autopsy records and the investigation reports of all the victims. They found all the cases shared the following characteristics. The victims were females over the age of 70, living alone in their own ground floor apartments. There were no signs of a break-in. All the apartments were ransacked. In some of the cases, money and or jewelry were taken. All the victims were stabbed in the neck, mostly on the left side, and none of the victims had defensive injuries. The criminal often spent time in the apartments after he killed the women. He would ransack drawers, searching for money and jewelry. He would wash his hands and he would smoke and leave cigarette butts at the scene. The profile indicated this was not the MO for the local criminals, and it was probable the offender was an immigrant. He was skilled in using a knife and displayed features of antisocial personality disorder and was sexually motivated. It was suspected he might have a prior arrest for sex-related crimes or attempted murder. On September 5, 1997, a man identified as Ben Mohammed Ezzedine Sebai, a 35-year-old Tunisian, was arrested. He was originally from Cairon, in Tunisia, and in 1990 had immigrated illegally to Italy. Sebai was arrested while attempting to board a train after his last murder. The next-door neighbor of the last victim, who was only 8 years old, identified him as the man he saw discarding blood-stained clothing. It was found that within a year of arriving in Italy, he was charged with attempted murder and rape by the police of Bolzano in northern Italy. An expulsion order was issued, but Sebai fled before the trial and took refuge in the province of Foggia, which is southern Italy, where he worked occasionally as a farm laborer. Sebai was charged and convicted of 4 of the murders and was given a life sentence. In 2005, he confessed to the murders of 4 additional elderly women, for which 9 other people had already been previously tried and convicted, among them Vincenzo Don Vito, who had been sentenced to 22 years. He committed suicide in jail. In 2007, Sebai finally confessed to committing 15 murders that occurred between 1995 and 1997. Based upon Sebai's confession, his lawyer was indicted for homicide in the death of the minor young man who committed suicide in jail prior to Sebai's admission, since his client had already told him he was guilty of all 15 murders. Surprisingly, 3 cases which had been committed in 1995 were originally classified as natural deaths. Sebai also admitted to experiencing sexual gratification at every homicide scene, even though there was no physical proof at most of the crime scenes. His fingerprints were found at 2 of the locations. When Sebai was interviewed in prison, he met all the clinical criteria for antisocial personality disorder and sexual sadism. He described where he chose his victim randomly, and once chosen, he would study the woman's habits and pick a time when she was alone. He would approach the victim at home using the pretext of selling holy pictures. Then he would overpower them. He chose to stab in the neck because it would produce a rapid death. He said this reminded him of, quote, ritual slaughter very common in Muslim life, in the preparation of Muslim meat or halal. Animals are killed by having their throats cut wide open while fully conscious and bled to death, end quote. The offender described where his father was physically and sexually abusive. He would strike him on his feet after hanging him upside down, and he would also insert objects into his anus. His grandmother was overbearing and abusive and allowed him to be abused by his uncles. He was also sexually abused by his first imam at his Muslim school, and also in Turkish baths by black-dressed old women who were friends of his mother and grandmother. These women were dressed in traditional black clothing, similar to those by older women in southern Italy. Sebai claimed he committed the murders for hatred of his mother, who took him to the Turkish baths where he was used as a sexual object by his mother's friends, who humiliated and raped him. These abuses led him to experience a deep repulsion for women, the engine that would lead him to kill. In 2012, Sebai was found hanging in his cell in the prison of Padua. He had been sentenced to 4 life sentences for his crimes. As of May 2024, trials for people convicted of the same murders confessed by Sebai have not been reopened. Though serial killers that target older women are rare, it is not unheard of. In May 2022, Billy Kipkorir Shemirmir was charged with smothering to death 18 elderly women over a 2-year crime spree. Born in Kenya, Africa, he immigrated to Texas. Police described where he went door to door at independent living apartments and pretended he was a maintenance worker. He stalked other women at Walmart and followed them home. He would kill them by smothering them with a pillow over their face. He would steal jewelry, cash, and any precious items he could find. In September 2023, he was found dead in his cell at Cofield Unit in Tennessee Colony, Texas. He was killed by his cellmate, who was in prison for a murder conviction. It seems that Apula and the surrounding areas are steeped in petty crimes, but violence as well. The criminal organization Sacra Corona Unita, or SCU, that translates into United Holy Crown, originated there sometime between the late 1970s and early 1980s. It is credited with transforming the rules of traditional mafia organizations. In 2020, a wave of murders related to the mafia swept through the area based on a new clan that emerged. There was an average of one murder per week, one robbery per day, and an extortion attempt every 48 hours. The Sacra Corona Unita is tied to a series of ambushes and drive-by shootings that ended with 17 deaths. The violence exemplifies lawlessness in some parts of Apula, which have targeted multiple family members. These are often planned in advance, and the perpetrator then commits suicide. The violence is often reflected in familial and domestic violence among the residents. Now remember, this area, this is in the boot of, if you look at Italy, it's shaped like a boot. This is in the heel part of Italy. It's small. And my point is that for the amount of people that are there, they have a lot of violence. And I was surprised because I had never heard of this Sacra Corona Unita. And apparently they're like an, an older version of what we think of in the mafia here, but they've taken it a step higher, you look at these old movies like The Godfather and all this other stuff, and you always see the old mafia, or what originally even in the 1920s was called the Black Hand, and this was a man thing. You never interfered with families or children. That was like off limits. This was, whatever. Not these people. If they come after you, it's like you have to fear for your life and your families. And even from what they describe, you will even get some of the members that are willing to like suicide themselves in the attempt. All right. So there's a lot of there was a lot, or there is. This is a present tense version of as far as what they're going through with violence there, and this upgrade. And they have also, and I put on here for those of you watching the video version, they even have certain tattoos that are tied as almost as identifications, large tattoos that they have all over their body to basically show their affiliation. Very, very much like what you see in these gangs from South and Central America, Tren MS-13. Somebody that doesn't know just sees a bunch of sometimes very large tattoos, but they have special significance. They're not random, or what they choose is not random. So it's the same thing, only it's the Italian version of it. And also, as I was reading, usually serial killers that target women as their preferred victims, they usually go for the younger women, middle-aged younger women. They don't really go after the older woman. And for example, this one in Texas from Billy Shermirmir, surprisingly, the only reason this guy was caught was he was going in and he was suffocating these women. And their cause of death was being closed out as natural death. And the only reason he got caught is he did that to a lady who had a pacemaker. And because he would steal everything from inside their apartments. And a neighbor came over, found her, and I guess the pacemaker kept her alive, and they were able to bring her back. They saved her life. And she was the one that said, hey, this man came to the door, and that's what he would do. He would pose as a maintenance man. And then is when they reopened all the prior cases and realized, wait a minute, uh, guess what? This is not, these people were murdered. So yes, this is an unusual trend as far as serial killers. And there you go. But let's go on to the next one. Our next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, is titled Haunted Military Hospital. The first military hospital in Aldershot, Hampshire, was situated near a church. It was established as a lunatic asylum and pestilence hospital. It was close by was the Union Hospital, which started out as a poorhouse, During the mid 1800s, the Connaught Hospital for a while specialized in treating men with venereal disease and ended as a dental facility which closed its doors in 1973. However, long before it was abandoned, there were stories about a mysterious gray lady. The Union Hill building on Hospital Hill in Aldershot was once part of the manor belonging to the Tichborne family, which dates back to 1629. It would go on to become the Aldershot Workhouse, and then in 1850 it was a school for pauper children. It evolved into a military hospital, but it proved too small, which led to the building of the Cambridge Military Hospital, which opened on July 18, 1879. Its patients were injured soldiers from the Boer War through the First Gulf War. One of its mysteries is the identity of who designed the building. The best guess is that he was a royal engineer. It was built by Martin Wells and Company. After the end of World War II, the hospital started to take civilians as patients. Another hospital in Aldershot was the Connaught Hospital, finished in 1898. It was an isolation hospital and during World War I provided over 1,000 beds, with two-thirds used as a lunatic asylum and those suffering from mental problems due to the war. In October 1941, the Connaught was handed over to the Canadian Army Medical Corps, who left in 1946. Eventually, the building was declared unsafe and the last units were moved out, An Army report of 1984 noted the building was in an extremely distressed state and it was demolished by the end of the 1980s. However, only the Cambridge lays claim to a haunting, and not in the mortuary, which is a small building that sits detached on the perimeter of the hospital, but on the upper floor between wards 10 and 14. She is known as the Grey Lady, and a smell of lavender surrounds her apparition. The story told of the origins of the ghost is that she was a member of Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps, who committed suicide by throwing herself from the upper floor walkway. It was precipitated by guilt after she gave a soldier a fatal drug overdose by accident. It is believed that in the afterlife she is trying to help those dying to transition to the death state, since her appearance coincides with dying or very ill patients. Witnesses describe where the corridor would turn freezing cold. Nurses and other employees would use the stairs and other paths between wards to avoid the spooky section where she is seen. One of the encounters was described this way, quote, "It was 1986 and I was in Ward 9 or Ward 10, not sure which, on the top floor, overlooking the back of the hospital, having had a hiatus hernia operation. Being quite ill, I was in the first bed on the right next to the nurse's station and was propped up with several pillows as I could not lie down. This made sleep difficult, although I did doze off and wake up again every 15 minutes or so. I still recall it felt like sleep deprivation. On one of my many moments of wakefulness at around 2 a.m., I observed a woman in uniform standing by a bed 3 down from me on my side of the ward, and I genuinely thought she was the duty officer doing her rounds, but was a bit confused by her uniform, which looked a bit dated as the skirt was very long and she had a stiff starched collar. Her headpiece was also starched and very wide in a diamond shape, and it came further forward over her forehead, more than those which are clipped onto the back of the head. I noticed she was also wearing stiff white cuffs on her sleeves and a cape, but it was gray and not red. The most unusual aspect was that I could not see her face. That is, I could see it, which was oval, but she seemed to have no features. But I put this down to the fact that I was extremely tired and my eyes may not have been focusing. When the nurse came round in the morning delivering washing bowls to those of us unable to get out of bed, I asked her who the QA officer had been. She said that no one had visited the ward that night, not even a duty officer, and asked why I wanted to know. So I told her about the old-fashioned uniform, which looked very smart but a bit out of place. She turned white and her eyes opened wide as she said, "Oh my God, you have seen the Gray Lady." She then went on to very helpfully explain to a very ill patient that anyone who sees the Gray Lady will die. Thankfully, I am not particularly superstitious, and I told her that this was nonsense, as how could anyone else know that a patient had seen the Gray Lady if they were dead? She reluctantly agreed, but her shock was tangible. The crux of the story is that the fellow in the bed 3 down from me, the bed at which I had seen the Gray Lady standing, was found dead when they brought breakfast round a few minutes later. I went up the stairs, and just as I went through the door into the section where the chapel chairs were, I saw a figure moving in between the rows of chairs. She had a veil on, similar but not quite the same as the nursing officers. Not as starched, but I thought it was because there was only minimal lighting on. I didn't say anything or walk forward, but when she walked around the end of the chairs, I couldn't see her feet. Her dress stopped mid-calf, and there was nothing below that level. As I started walking forward, she just disappeared. The doors at either end of that section of corridor did not move. I turned around and went back down the stairs, walked along the main corridor to the next flight of stairs, went up, told my friend what I had seen. One of the senior nurses there, who knew the history of the building, said that the original floor had been 12 to 18 inches lower, which would explain the missing feet. End quote. In 1899, several soldiers died at the hospital after they returned from maneuvers at the Salisbury Plain. Two had died from what seemed to be potamine poisoning. Another named Leslie of the 2nd Royal Highlanders also died, and 18 more were in the hospital with fears they would all succumb. It was believed that tin food they took on maneuvers were contaminated. In 1930, George Devon had gone to the hospital for an operation for a perforated gastric ulcer. The 54-year-old was in recovery. However, he told his wife he could not sleep because he thought someone was going to shoot him. He was known as a reliable and happy man, but an attendant at the hospital noticed that he was quite morose, kind of sardonic, and had a strange smile. He was removed from the large ward because he was disturbing the other patients. When the attendant was building up a fire, he took a razor he had asked his wife to bring him and tried to cut his throat. This was against the rules to bring a razor to any patient, and the hospital would make arrangements for the shaving of patients, I guess because of this reason. It was taken away from him before he could harm himself more. At some point, he got hold of another razor and cut his throat again, this time fatally. The hospital was eventually closed on February 9, 1996, because asbestos was found. It was deemed too expensive to make the necessary improvements and maintain such an old building. No doubt, after so many years treating those who were ill and dying, there are others who perhaps linger in the long, dark hallways besides the mysterious Gray Lady. So, on to our next story. And this one, we are going to go to Mysterious Universe, and this is titled Bizarre and Outlandish Claims and Conspiracies of the Moon. There is little doubt that the moon is one of the most fascinating objects in the night sky. It is also at the center of some of the most outrageous and bizarre claims and conspiracies on record. Not least just why NASA has not returned since the last moon landing in December 1972. Okay, those are my little animals making themselves known. Some of these conspiracies suggest there are the remains of alien bases and technology on the moon, while others go even further and suggest there is an extraterrestrial presence on our cosmic satellite. Some researchers have even suggested that the moon is not a natural satellite at all, but some kind of mechanical construct designed and built at an unknown location and placed in orbit by an unknown intelligence. The fact is, though, even without these conspiracies, the moon is a celestial body full of anomalies. While some people might be familiar with them, before we explore some of these outrageous conspiracies and claims of our celestial satellite, it is worth quickly going over some of the truly anomalous facts about the moon. It is, for example, exactly 400 times smaller than the sun, and its distance from the Earth relative to the overall distance to the sun is also exactly 1 out of 400th. It is worth noting that these figures are not approximate, they are exact. It is because of these astounding dimensions that total eclipses are experienced here on Earth. Moreover, if these dimensions were out in any way whatsoever, this wouldn't be possible. Incidentally, we should also take note that the chances of these specific dimensions occurring naturally are zillions to one. What's more, these figures and dimensions are not seen in any other known moon. Even its perfectly circular orbit is unique. Most moons' orbits are elliptical, and its rotation around the planet is such that one side permanently remains hidden from us. Looking a little closer, the many craters on the lunar surface creates further problems in our understanding of the moon. These craters, of which there are many, are for the most part very similar in depth and relatively shallow at that. In terms of our understanding of modern science, these craters should be much more varied, with at least some showing greater depth at the impact point, which should be the outcome for a naturally formed rocky terrestrial body. Many researchers suggest that it is the absolute high velocity of the meteor strikes that creates these crater anomalies. However, the actual reason for this, at least according to some researchers both inside and outside the mainstream, is because the moon is not naturally occurring at all, but a hollow object with a metallic casing beneath an artificial rocky surface. Perhaps one of the most interesting considerations is how the moon came to orbit the Earth in the first place. Accepted thinking suggests a small planet, or large moon collided with Earth millions of years ago, causing the moon to form out of the debris of such a collision, which then settled into its current orbit. However, not only because of the remarkable zillion to one dimensions and distances of the moon we highlighted earlier, but also because of several other anomalies. Many people question just how true it is that the moon was simply a happy accident and a product of coincidence. In fact, some people have even questioned if the moon was purposely placed into orbit, perhaps even by an unknown intelligence. Author William Roy Shelton stated, quote, "It is important to remember that something had to put the moon in or near its current circular pattern around the Earth. It is very unlikely that any object just stumbles on the right combination of factors needed to help an object stay in orbit. Something had to put the moon on its altitude, on its course and speed. The question is, what was that something?" End quote. Isaac Asimov, a Russian professor of biochemistry, made similar comments when he wrote, quote, "We cannot help but come to the conclusion that the moon, by rights, ought not to be there. The fact that it is one of those strokes of luck almost too good to accept. Small planets such as Earth, with weak gravitational fields, might well lack satellites. In general, then, when a planet does have satellites, those satellites are much smaller than the planet itself. Therefore, there would be every reason to suspect the moon would be a tiny world, perhaps 30 miles, but it is a giant satellite, 2,160 miles in diameter. How is it then that tiny Earth has one?" End quote. There are plenty of other people who have expressed similar sentiments. NASA scientist Robin Brett stated that it seems easier to explain the non-existence of the moon than its existence, while Erwin Shapiro from the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics offered that the best explanation for the moon is an observational error. Perhaps some of the most intriguing and thought-provoking claims are those that suggest the moon is a hollow object. Of course, if the moon were hollow, it would suggest it was artificial. As Carl Sagan noted, a natural satellite cannot be a hollow object. Perhaps one of the first people to legitimately question whether the moon could be a hollow object was NASA scientist Dr. Gordon MacDonald, who wrote in 1962, "If the astronomical data are reduced, it is found that the data require that the interior of the moon be less dense than the outer parts. Indeed, it would seem that the moon is more like a hollow than a homogeneous sphere." In November 1969, when Apollo 12 left the moon, rocket boosters were purposely jettisoned into the surface where seismic measuring equipment had been set up to record and measure the impact. To say scientists were shocked by the returning data would be an understatement. It was noted that the moon reverberated like a bell for almost an hour following the impact, something that would only be seen in a hollow object. Indeed, as we can see, the moon has undoubtedly been an object of fascination since the beginning of the human race, or has it? Without a doubt, one of the most thought-provoking claims about the moon is that at some point in human history, it didn't exist. There was essentially a time before the moon. As we might imagine, almost all mainstream historians and astronomers reject such an idea. There was once a time in, relatively speaking, recent history, certainly recent enough to be human history, when the moon was not in orbit around our planet, not least as at least as far as our current understanding of the world is. Life on Earth would be almost impossible without it. However, while we most certainly should treat such considerations with caution, there are some intriguing and thought-provoking arguments to be made. We might consider, for example, that this time before the moon was when a now lost civilization called the planet home. Perhaps backing this up somewhat are the many legends and myths of such a time and such a civilization from around the world. Many researchers suggest that such legends hold at least partial truths within them, with one such researcher, Michael Tellinger, stating that these legends of a time before the moon could very well be one of humanity's earliest collective memories. One of the earliest accounts of a time before the moon comes from the Greek philosopher Aristotle. In his history of the Arcadian region in Greece, he refers the Pelagians, a civilization he claimed had resided in the area since very old times, during a time when the moon did not exist. Moreover, Aristotle wasn't the only ancient Greek philosopher to have spoken of such a time. Apollonius, for example, wrote of a time when the moon didn't orbit the earth and even when all the celestial objects were yet to be present in the sky. During this time, the only civilization on Earth was the Pelesians, who resided in the mountains of Arcadia. Is it really possible that the Pelesians did exist? And if so, did they reside on Earth before the moon orbited the planet? Once more, current knowledge suggests that life on Earth would be almost impossible. Could the Pelesians, however, have managed to survive in Arcadia, perhaps one of the few habitable locations on Earth? Might they have even lived under the ground, perhaps giving birth to the many legends of an ancient civilization living inside the inner Earth? Or might we even consider that this civilization was not entirely human and was of extraterrestrial origin, perhaps even with connections to the gods themselves? Perhaps, and above all else, though, if the Pelesians did exist, just how long ago were they present on Earth? Could it be tens of thousands of years ago, or perhaps hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years? We can find another writer from antiquity who speaks of a time before the moon in Plutarch, who wrote of a time before the birth of Zeus, when the Arcadians possessed their land, adding that these folks are older than the moon. Hippolytus also made similar statements, offering that the Arcadians brought forth Pelagus, the ancestor of the Pelagians, who were of greater antiquity than the moon. Perhaps not endorsing the claim in his work Astrology, Lucianus also states that the Arcadians foolishly claim they are older than the moon. There are such claims to be found in biblical writings. In the book of Job, for example, it states that the Lord makes peace in the heights during a time before there was a moon and it did not shine. In Psalms, there's also a passage that states, since the time of the sun and before the time of the moon, an era that was said to be a generation of generations ago, seemingly a length of time that is perhaps so great that it is immeasurable. Similar claims are found in many other ancient writings and creation stories around the world, including other biblical stories such as the flood. Just one example is the oral tradition of the Columbian civilizations in the Bogota highlands of South America, which speaks of the earliest times when the moon was not yet in the heavens. We turn our attention to the Zulu legends from Africa. We find even more remarkable accounts of a time before the moon. Their legend states that the moon was brought to the earth thousands of years ago by two extraterrestrial brothers named Wawani and Mapanku. We might note that this story of two extraterrestrial brothers coming to the earth thousands of years ago is remarkably similar to the accounts of the Anunnaki from ancient Sumer, which speaks of two brothers, Enlil and Enki, who descended from the heavens and ruled over the earth. Could this once again suggest that the Pelesians, if they are the same ancient civilization described around the world, were of extraterrestrial origin? Another interesting detail is that of the Pelesians' language was described as barbaric. Could this description have been so because it was simply incomprehensible to humanity because it was quite literally an alien language? With the detail of an alien race bringing the moon to Earth in deep antiquity in mind, we should turn to the ancient writings and symbols in the courtyard of Calasaya in Bolivia, a site said to be around 15,000 years old. The ancient writings there suggest that the moon was brought to Earth many thousands of years ago. What's more, it replaced a smaller moon that had been orbiting Earth previously. If there is any truth in such legends, might this explain how civilizations could have existed before the moon we see today? Because another moon was present in the skies before that, which provided the stabilization needed for life to flourish. It is also possible that the arrival of this new moon could have caused temporary cataclysmic events on Earth, which could have also given rise to such legends as the flood and even the lost civilization of Atlantis. What is further interesting about the idea of a second or previous moon orbiting Earth before the arrival of our current moon is that several researchers have put forth genuine suggestions that Earth could have had a moon, perhaps even several, before our current moon arrived and began its orbit. Some have gone even further, offering that our current moon could have collided with one of these previous moons before settling into its orbit. Do these theories, if they were to be true, offer corroboration to the legends in the courtyard of Kalasaya? We might also consider just how many records of the Americas, particularly those of South America, were lost to the actions of the Spanish conquistadors, who destroyed almost all the records of the respective civilizations of the continent. Many of these records could very well have told us much more about our collective history than many of us could perhaps imagine, including of a time before the moon. We should also note that in antiquity, writing was not as widespread or as cheap as it is today. Indeed, it was costly to record information and time consuming. As such writing, at least official records and documentation, was reserved for events that were of great importance and not fanciful stories. We might consider then that such ancient writings that speak of a time before the moon should be contemplated a little more seriously. We have already explored what an anomaly the moon is. Could it be so because its history and origins are much more explosive, fascinating, and far reaching than the current mainstream thinking suggests it is? And could there have been a time in human history when the moon didn't exist, at least not in our skies? The suggestion that the moon was brought to Earth by an extraterrestrial race was not only made in ancient times. Alex Collier, for example, offered that his research suggests that the moon was in fact a transport ship that brought reptilians, human reptilian hybrids, and the first humans to set foot on Earth. He made the claims along with several others in the book Letters from Andromeda, a book he put together, he claimed, through telepathic communication with extraterrestrial entities from a constellation called Zenithtae of the moon. As it is today, he wrote, quote, "The moon is hollow. It contains huge underground facilities built by ETs and later humans from Earth. There are 7 openings into the moon's crust and the underground bases. Conservative scientists have wondered why so many craters seem so shallow, despite their size. The Andromedans say it's because much of the surface was built on top of a metallic shell of a circular space crest, a war carrier, as the Andromedans describe it." End quote. Collier also claimed that bases from this ancient war, which raged 113,000 years ago, remained in ruins on the moon, adding that both extraterrestrials and humans are living on the moon right now, in underground bases that housed over 30,000 people and contained several Great Lakes. Even more remarkable were his claims that there were plans to send many more people to the moon in the future. Moreover, he claimed that advanced weapons, vehicles, and anti-gravity technologies were tested on the moon, and that over 50 Earth-built spacecraft were housed there. Whether he meant to or not, Collier also appears to corroborate some of the many conspiracies regarding secret societies of the world elite and their private missions to and on the moon when he wrote, quote, "When the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon, the world order had been there for some time. This knowledge and technology was withheld from the lower levels of NASA and our military. NASA has been used as a blind to keep people away from truly knowing what was going on there. The astronauts were silenced under threats and remain so today." End quote. While most dismiss Collier's claims, they are thought-provoking, perhaps particularly his claims of secret societies and their equally secret missions to the moon. It has been claimed by some that these secret societies have retained knowledge that goes back to the Crusades of the Knights Templar in the 12th century and preserved before that since biblical times. Researcher and author Mike Barra made very similar claims in his book Ancient Aliens and JFK, The Race to the Moon and the Kennedy Assassination. Before we move on to those, it is worth briefly examining the Apollo 11 moon landing mission and the alleged Masonic ritual and practices that surrounded it. The fact is that the Freemasons had, at the very least, an active interest in the Apollo missions was no secret. In the November 1969 edition of the New Age magazine, Buzz Aldrin, one of the men who would eventually walk on the moon, was featured speaking of his Masonic connections, with one particular quote stating, "When man reaches new worlds, Masonry will be there." Moreover, just wasn't Aldrin of the NASA astronauts who has such alleged Masonic and secret society connections. Leroy Gordon Cooper Jr., Virgil Grissom, and Don Else Isel were all said to be Freemasons, while John Glenn was also rumored to be a member of another secret society. Hold on. If we move on to the moon landings themselves, the landing site, the Sea of Tranquility, was selected due to the flat surface, which made landing easier. However, in the decades that have passed since, some researchers have suggested there could have been other reasons for this specific selection. One of the people not only responsible for selecting the landing destination as well as planning multiple other aspects of the moon landings was Farouk Elbaz, right down to developing the strict timing of the launch window and actual landing itself. Not only was Elbaz a Freemason, but his father was an expert in ancient Egyptian rituals, which makes for interesting reading when some of the conspiracies surrounding the moon landings are explored. The landing site, for example, included the exact time and date was meticulously worked out so that at exactly 33 minutes after landing, Orion's belt would be perfectly aligned with the moon's horizon. Of course, the fact that it was worked out That this occurred 33 minutes after landing is yet another sign of Masonic involvement when we remember how important the number 33 is in Freemasonry, representative of the 33rd degree Freemasons of the Scottish Rite. And it is not the only time the number 33 surfaces. The launch pad where the Apollo 11 mission began, launch pad 33 is a good example. Of further interest, when the first shuttle returned to Earth, it landed on runway 33. As well as the alleged rituals, it was also claimed by some that Aldrin left various Masonic gifts on the lunar surface, all of which contained very specific Masonic symbols and were an apparent offering to Osiris. Furthermore, after landing back on Earth, he is said to have gifted a Masonic scarf that had been blessed as part of a ritual on the lunar surface to the Scottish Rite Masonic Lodge in Washington, D.C. Another detail about the moon landings is the moon rocks that were brought to Earth by the Apollo astronauts, many of which have suspiciously gone missing. Some researchers have suggested that the missing moon rocks were not moon rocks at all, but ancient alien technology. Technology that, at least according to some researchers, was the real reason the moon landing went ahead in the first place. Claims of ancient alien technology on the moon lead us very nicely into one of the most interesting people of the Masonic conspiracy surrounding the moon landings, James Edwin Webb. Webb served as NASA's administrator from 1961 to 1968, leaving right before the Apollo 11 moon landing. Like many others involved in the Apollo program and NASA in general, Webb was a known Freemason and began placing fellow Masons into positions of power almost as soon as he took the position with NASA. Moreover, according to the previously mentioned Mike Barra, he is arguably at the center of not only the moon landing conspiracy but the assassination of President John Kennedy. Ultimately, it is claimed that the reason, at least partially, behind Kennedy's assassination was his desire to pursue a joint American-Soviet mission to land on the moon, and the reason why the alleged shadow government of the United States chose such a drastic course of action was because of their knowledge of ancient alien technology and alien bases on the lunar surface left by none other than the Anunnaki, the gods of ancient Sumer. Whatever the reason, Webb wasn't alone in immensely disliking even the idea of a joint mission to the moon with the Soviet Union. Another person was Congressman Albert Thomas, a close friend of Webb's and someone with ties to fellow Texan and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. He had publicly stated his opposition to any joint space missions with the Soviet Union, and because of his position, he would have had complete access to the budget and direction of NASA, as well as unofficially, of course, influencing its direction. And his book, Ancient Aliens and JFK, Mike Barra includes a photograph that, while not offering conclusive proof, is highly suggestive of some kind of plot involving Thomas and Johnson, as well as many others. The picture was taken in the seconds following Lyndon Johnson being sworn as President of the United States, and only hours after John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. You can see Johnson turning to look over his right shoulder towards none other than Albert Thomas, who, rather than having a solemn, shocked look on his face like almost everyone else in the room, appears to be smirking and winking at Johnson. Although we can't see now President Johnson's face, his left cheek is raised slightly as if he's smiling back at Thomas, almost as if they knew something and realized the plan had come together just as they desired. It is also worth pointing out that Johnson, like almost everyone else we have mentioned here, was a Freemason, a member of the 33-degree Scottish Rite Freemasons. It is important to point out that these actions of those individuals who happen to be Freemasons and not actions condoned or supported by Freemasonry in general. While such claims are undoubtedly up for debate, if there was any truth in the suggestion that the members of a secret society, not necessarily Freemasons, these individuals could have been Masons and also members of another unknown organization, orchestrated a mission to the moon to retrieve ancient alien technology. Technology that they became aware through their secret society connections, and that knowledge had been guarded and handed down for hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years. Then it forces to reassess so many aspects of our world history and reality. Here it is worth our time to briefly explore the remote viewing experiments of Ingo Swann, who was one of the CIA's most skilled remote viewers during the 1970s and 80s as part of the Project Stargate program that aimed to essentially keep a close eye through remote viewing on their Cold War adversaries, the Soviet Union. One particular episode, however, in February 1975 is of particular interest to us here. Swann was approached by a mysterious individual who introduced himself as Mr. Axelrod. informing him that he was required to work on a top secret remote viewing mission. A month passed before Swan heard from Axelrod again. This time Swan was told to meet him at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., which Swan agreed to. Once there, a car promptly pulled up and Mr. Axelrod got out and confirmed who he was to Swan before asking him to get into the car. At this point, they were driven to an unknown location, somewhere just outside of the city, where a helicopter was seemingly waiting for them. Before boarding the helicopter, however, Swan was blindfolded and told that where he was going was an ultra-secret location. After the helicopter touched down on the ground, still blindfolded, Swan was led to what seemed to be an elevator. A moment later, he felt the lift descending, a journey that seemed to take a considerable amount of time, leading Swan to conclude that he was being taken to a secret underground military facility. Then the elevator came to a sudden stop, and the doors opened. Swan was led to a room a short distance away, and the blindfold was finally removed. There, standing in front of him, was Mr. Axelrod. Here Mr. Axelrod introduced himself properly, offering that his name was indeed a pseudonym and that his real identity was protected given the nature of his work. He then began to question Swan about remote viewing, asking him all kinds of questions, including how he achieved his results. Eventually, he told Swan bluntly that he was prepared to offer him a lot of money for his services. Although he didn't feel it was an offer he could refuse, Swan accepted the invite. Then Axelrod began to question Swan and what he knew about the moon. Following this brief conversation, Swan was then given a piece of paper with coordinates written on and asked to remote view what was there. Swan focused on the coordinates and soon found himself leaving the Earth and heading to the moon, specifically the dark or far side. Moments later, much to his shock, he could see tall buildings and huge glass dome-like structures. He went towards one of these structures and went inside. As soon as he did so, he could see there were living entities inside. He began describing what he was seeing to Axelrod, who listened intently. When Swan offered that whoever the living entities were, they were aware of his presence, Axelrod suddenly became animated, insisting to Swan that he should come away from there right now. Swan suddenly felt uncomfortable by the entire experience and quickly found himself rushing back to his physical body. After taking a moment to come to his senses, he asked Axelrod what exactly he had just seen and asked if there was a colony of some kind on the far side of the moon. Axelrod, though simply, remained quiet. Now, having returned to his ultra-calm demeanor, Swan asked again, this time adding that he thought the living entities could have been extraterrestrial. To this Axelrod simply replied, "Isn't that something, huh?" Then he left the room and Swan was returned to the city. Whether or not there are extraterrestrial bases on the moon or not remains open to debate. There are, though, many intriguing anomalies on the lunar surface, anomalies that many people believe are artificial structures. These structures are thought-provoking to say the least. Some people, for example, have claimed they have spotted pyramid-like structures on the surface of the moon, structures that appear to be too precise to be the result of geological processes. Near the Aristarchus crater is another apparent artificial structure known as the Tower of Babel. As its name suggests, this alleged building is a towering, column-like formation that appears to be of significant height. Some estimates suggest it is as tall as 7 miles high, although skeptics argue that this tower-like appearance could be essentially a trick of the light, making what is, they say, a natural rock formation appear much larger than it actually is. A similar alleged artificial structure can be found in the Ina Caldera region. Known as the Ina Bridge, the bridge-like structure appears to be an artificial structure, essentially a bridge connecting two parts of the lunar surface. Another apparent anomaly on the surface of the moon is known as the Shard, which appears similar to the previously mentioned Tower of Babel in that it seems to tower above the moon's surface. To some people, this is clear evidence of some kind of alien outpost or possibly even proof of a civilization that once called the moon home. Although skeptics have claimed, as usual, that the shard is nothing more than an optical illusion, the fact that it appears to cast a shadow would suggest that whatever it is something real and physically there. It is also worth mentioning the castle-like structure, unsurprisingly dubbed the Castle, that was captured in one of the images of the Apollo missions. What has perplexed many who have viewed the picture is that this seemingly artificial structure seems to be somehow floating above the moon's surface. At this point, it would be beneficial to explore one of the strangest of all conspiracies surrounding the moon, those of the secret Apollo missions that ran, at least according to some, under the name Project Horizon. The origins of the project go back to the 1950s and look to build a permanent base on the lunar surface. It was brought to a close not long after, but some people have suggested that the project continued to operate behind closed doors, specifically following the official closure of the Apollo missions. Although Apollo 17 was the last official Apollo mission, some researchers have suggested that the Apollo 18, 19, and 20 missions went ahead in secret without the public being aware of them. While it is easy to dismiss such claims as outlandish nonsense, it is interesting to note that the three missions, 18, 19, and 20, had already been budgeted and paid for when they were scrapped, something which simply made no financial sense. Although information on the alleged secret missions is limited, it is claimed that the Apollo 18 and 19 missions did indeed find evidence of alien bases on the lunar surface. Some sources claim that Apollo 19 was lost in a collision during its respective mission. During the alleged Apollo 20 mission, however, they discovered not only the remains of alien bases and technology, but of a female alien humanoid. One of the alleged pilots on these discrete Apollo missions, William Rutledge, released a video on YouTube in 2007 that appeared to show parts of the Apollo 20 mission, including footage of the alien girl they discovered. Several years after the release of the footage, in 2011, Italian UFO researcher Luca Scantaburio investigated the case and spoke directly with Rutledge, who told him that he wasn't employed for the missions by NASA, but by the United States Air Force. He elaborated that he had previously worked on the study of foreign technology, Russian only, as well as working on the N-1 project, the Ajax plane project, and the MiG Foxbat 25. He further stated that he had some skills for using computer navigation and was a volunteer for the MOL Gemini project. Even stranger, especially when we consider the claims that President Kennedy was assassinated, at least in part, because of his desire to embark on a joint moon landing mission. Rutledge stated that the Apollo 20 mission was a joint American-Soviet mission and launched in 1976, a year, incidentally, after the famous handshake in space that saw American astronauts meet Soviet cosmonauts during the Apollo-Soyuz test project in the summer of 1975. Rutledge detailed how the Apollo 20 mission headed to the Delport Isaac region on the far side of the moon. Almost as soon as they touched down and ventured outside, they made remarkable discovery after remarkable discovery. They found, for example, the crashed and crippled remains of an ancient spacecraft that they estimated was around 2.5 miles long. Not far from the remains of this crashed craft, they came upon the remains of what would appear to be an old and abandoned city, a location they referred to as Moon City, but was labeled Station 1 by those in charge of the mission on Earth. When they ventured into the city and explored some of the buildings, they discovered that it was littered with what they described as space garbage and various gold parts of scrap. We might note, if there's any truth to the idea that Anunnaki constructed the bases on the moon, the discovery of gold makes a certain amount of sense given their desire to mine gold on Earth, as well as its value for space travelers. One building, however, appeared to be relatively undamaged and largely intact, a building they named the Cathedral. The most enthralling discoveries, though, occurred when they returned to the ruined spacecraft and prepared to investigate inside. Upon entering the craft, they discovered several strange triangular rocks as well as what appeared to be vegetation growing inside the vehicle. This notion of vegetation inside a UFO, as bizarre as it sounds, has surfaced in several other reports of close UFO encounters, with one particular incident from the United Kingdom in the mid-1970s, suggesting this vegetation was somehow connected to the propulsion of the craft. They also found the bodies of several small beings, each about 4 inches long, that seemed to spend their lives in tubes. These strange beings were discovered throughout the vehicle. Without a doubt, the most remarkable discovery, however, was of 2 humanoid bodies. One of these was destroyed, although it was unclear what had happened or caused such damage. The crew preserved the head of this first body. The other, however, was undamaged and well preserved. The crew eventually dubbed the second humanoid Mona Lisa. Rutledge elaborated that Mona Lisa was in some state of suspended animation and was neither dead nor alive. Ultimately, the crew decided to transfer this female humanoid to their craft. Rutledge informed Scantaburio that he didn't remember who had named the girl Mona Lisa, whether it was himself or Lenov, a cosmonaut, but he could recall that she was found that she was around 5.5 feet tall, with long hair and 5 fingers and a thumb, which led them to guess that their mathematics are based on 12 inches as opposed to 10 like humans. He continued that she was clearly a pilot and that there was a piloting device fixed to her fingers and eyes. They removed this device, which included having to cut through two cables that were connected to the nose. After doing this, concretions of blood or biological liquid erupted and froze from the mouth, nose, eyes, and some other parts of the body. It also appeared that the humanoid skin was protected by a thin, transparent film. Although none of the crew had medical training, they decided to fix their bioequipment to the body of Mona Lisa, and the telemetry received by the mission control meds was positive. In other words, she was alive. He finally stated that she was returned to Earth with the Apollo 20 vehicle, where she remained today, at the time of speaking. Interestingly or not, Rutledge's half acknowledged how bizarre and outlandish his claim sounded, but he insisted he was genuine, stating, "I'm the whistleblower. What can NASA or the United States Air Force do now? Blocking or suing me would be an acknowledgement. They can only speak of a hoax or fiction. It is certainly something to think about." It is perhaps fitting to end by exploring future visits to the moon, or more to the point, locations that are said to be off limits to any future moon landing missions. While there are several locations that have been officially designated as restricted, several whistleblowers have come forward over the years stating that NASA has ulterior motives for designing these locations as forbidden, and that they have several other unofficial locations that they seek to avoid any missions exploring. We know, for example, that Tranquility Base, the landing site for the Apollo 11 mission, is under the protection of these laws as initiated by the United States government, and is akin to a cosmic cultural heritage site that might one day be visited by future astronauts, and perhaps as technology develops will be a destination for space tourists. However, some people have questioned NASA's true motives for putting the destination off limits, offering that the real reason is to protect against the discovery of the remains of ancient alien bases and technology. The speculation becomes even more intriguing when we factor in the alleged recordings of Armstrong and Aldrin discussing seeing alien vehicles on the lunar surface, although debate remains as to exactly what was being discussed and indeed if the recording is authentic. What about these other locations, though? One such alleged forbidden lunar destination is the Mendeleev Ridge, which could very well hold an abundance of information about past volcanic activity on the moon. However, it has also been suggested that the location would be ideal for building hidden lunar bases, ones built by humans under highly secret space programs. A similar location is the Compton-Belkovich volcanic complex on the moon's far side. This volcanic structure likely holds similar information, with some scientists arguing that it could have been active relatively recently. Like the Mendeleev Ridge, though, it would be another ideal location for discreetly built structures. Moreover, the location could also be home to highly valuable materials and minerals that could be discreetly transported back to Earth. We can find another highly interesting and to some suspicious location near the center of the moon's near side in the Sinus Medi or Medi region. While we should treat the claims with caution, some have claimed that highly advanced and secret observation equipment has been left for monitoring events on Earth, as well as equally advanced lunar facilities. Furthermore, unlike some of the other locations we have looked at, there appears to be no good reason why NASA or any other organization would want access to the location restricted. If we move to the moon's south pole, we find the Leibniz Plateau, another alleged off-limits location. This region sits on remarkably flat and elevated terrain, which once more has caused speculation of advanced lunar bases and even landing zones for advanced space vehicles being present there. There are also several craters that, at least according to some, have been designated as no-go areas. One such location is the Tycho crater, while another is the Telzhevsky crater. Once more, there could be very reasonable reasons as to why NASA would wish to keep such areas preserved, not least the possibility of studying ice deposits there. However, like many of the volcanic regions, such craters would present the option for discrete lunar bases. Only time will tell if these and other locations of the moon will be studied up close and transparently. For all of the missions to the lunar surface, the majority of the moon remains unexplored and uncharted, at least officially. And perhaps because of that, such conspiracies and wild claims as we have examined here are allowed to flourish in that void of information. That is not to say that there might not be at least some truth to some of those claims. As we have established, The moon is a genuine anomaly that, for all the official theories, remains largely unexplained. Could the moon have been placed in orbit by an unknown intelligence, and is that intelligence still present on the moon today? Could our cosmic satellite be an artificial construct, something more akin to a space station that once brought extraterrestrials to Earth many thousands of years ago? And if so, did it replace our natural moon that has sustained life on Earth perhaps for many thousands of years before that? The fact is, there remain many unanswered questions about the moon, its origin, and whether it might have served as a colony for an ancient spacefaring civilization. While many of the claims about the moon we have examined here should be treated with caution and are admittedly unlikely, they remain a possibility and a part of the mystery of the already fascinating object in our night sky. And there you go. You know what? There's also I'm sure everybody's heard this, the conspiracy that we never went to the moon, that it was all staged. In other words, like was shot in a studio, that we never went there. At this point, I had heard so many things have recently come out. The JFK files have been released. I'm thinking in its entirety, but even then we really don't know. So maybe the answer will be found there. If there was, if, how's this? If, as it claims, one of the reasons why President Kennedy was killed was because of something having to do with a UFO slash ET slash moon exploration, who knows? Hopefully it'll come out. Somebody's going through all these thousands of papers. And also lately with this Doge effort, we've found how many millions and billions of dollars have been funneled away through different programs that you would say, well, you know what, to do all these programs and NASA, and that has got to cost so much money. You know, and we found out that yes, that lots of money, lots of money for other things, but let's say to pay for all these, you know, trips, technology, development of technology. Yeah, apparently there was, and I think to personally, I believe that this money that has been funneled off to places that the American taxpayer had no idea about is going back decades. I don't think it was something recent. I think that as time has gone by, they diverted to different destinations for whatever reason to either fund something that they know that the Americans taxpayer will go, no, or something like this. Because I don't think Americans would have ever said, "Oh, we're going to keep on funding further, space exploration to the moon." Americans would have been fine with that. So that's what I'm saying. Going to things that they shouldn't, or that funding these programs, the idea wasn't to make that secret. It was to keep the whole endeavor secret. And of course, you have to pay for everything. So yeah, a lot of the conspiracies that was described there, once upon a time, were like, that's way out there. But lately, with things that are coming to the surface, they still are conspiracies, but I hate to say it, but they're not as outlandish as they've once been. Not at all. I mean, nowadays, everybody's like, well, what's next? What's next on the weird world we live in? Unfortunately, it's more than that. But let's see what comes of all this new information that's being disseminated finally to the normies, as in us. For us to make decisions if we approve or disapprove of what's been going on. So till next time, believe me, Eerie News, it's always around, and that's just a great example of what I've been reading so far. Till next time.